October 1944, over the northern Mariana Islands. The world is reduced to ink and static. At 22,000 feet, a lone Nakajima J1N1 gecko, Irving slices through the Pacific night. Inside the cramped cockpit, the universe is a study in monochrome, the greenish glow of instrument dials paints the pilot's face, a mask of concentrated strain, below an ocean of pure black, above a canopy of stars, cold and indifferent. His eyes, wide and unblinking, scour the darkness. They dance from the faint luminescence of the engine, exhausts to the impenetrable void beyond the windscreen. Every shadow is a potential silhouette, every wisp of cloud a phantom bomber, his. Breathing is a steady rhythm against the drone of the twin engines. He is hunting, but without a sight, he is a sentry in a boundless, senseless domain. Tonight, the enemy is out there. The distant, thrumming vibration in the air tells him. So the sound of 100 American B-29 superfortresses, a rumor in the sky long. Before they are seen, his aircraft is equipped with a weapon more advanced than most. In Japan's arsenal, a pair of upward-firing 20mm cannons, the shred music, but the guns are useless without a target. Success hinges entirely on the biological technology. In his skull, his dark-adapted vision, his instinct, his sheer, unaided will to see. He does not know that in the formation of bombers ahead, operators are watching. Glowing cathode ray tubes. On their screens, the city of Tokyo is not a hidden mystery. But a detailed map of radar returns, and his own aircraft, a tiny, blipping echo, is being plotted in a vector of cold, electronic calculation. For him, the night is a shroud. For them, it is becoming a transparent shield. The fundamental nature of warfare is shifting. Here in the dark, from human eye to machine pulse. The hook is complete. This moment captures the visceral, human vulnerability of Japan's night defenders on the cusp of a technological revolution they could not match. The war in the Pacific, in its early, blazing chapters, was fought in a theater of intense light. The sun illuminated the devastating plunges of dive bombers, the twisting contrails of dogfights over coral atolls, and the fiery wrecks of warships in turquoise lagoons. For the Empire of Japan, this was the expected war, a conflict decided by superior will, pilot skill, and tactical daring, all exercised in the clarity of day. But by 1942, a new and deeply unsettling front opened. It had no geography, no fixed lines. It was defined not by space, but by time, the night. The impetus came from two Allied forces reeling from early defeats, the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, having seen its daylight bomber formations over Europe, mauled by fighters and flak, and possessing no long-range fighter escort for Pacific deep strikes, began to experiment. The British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, operating under the stark reality that daylight raids over occupied Europe were suicidal, had already committed to a strategic campaign under cover of darkness. This doctrine of night bombing migrated to the Pacific theater. Suddenly, Japanese-held islands and later the Japanese homeland itself faced a threat that seemed to defy the foundational samurai code of Bushido, an enemy that refused to meet them face-to-face in the honorable light of day. For Japanese military commanders, this was more than a tactical nuisance. It was a psychological affront. Their entire air defense system, from the elite fighter pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy to the ground spotters of the homeland, was engineered for visual engagement. Interception relied on a chain of human eyes, lookouts on remote islands, officers scanning the horizons from command posts, and, ultimately, the pilots themselves, whose training exalted the keen, individual vision of the master warrior. The night rendered this chain utterly blind. The first nocturnal raids by USAAF B-17s and B-24s, and later by RAF Liberators in the Burma theater, achieved a disquieting success. They bombed supply dumps, airfields, and shipping with near impunity, vanishing before the first scrambling fighters could even find their direction. Japan's initial response was a blend of improvisation and denial, searchlights borrowed From Army anti-aircraft units, probed the skies in clumsy cones, more likely to announce a bomber's presence to its companions than to hold it for interception. Barrage balloons were raised, and anti-aircraft artillery fired deafening but largely speculative volleys into the blackness, creating spectacular but ineffective displays of pyrotechnics. The fundamental problem remained: you could not kill what you could not see. This vulnerability struck at the heart of Japanese military psychology. The concept of metsuk, the penetrating gaze, the intuitive perception of an opponent's intention, was central to martial arts and by extension to aerial combat. The night bomber invalidated this centuries-old principle. It demanded not intuition, but instrumentation. Not a warrior's spirit, but an engineer's calibration. As the Allied night offensive expanded, transforming from a tactical irritant to a strategic threat, Japan faced a stark choice: adapt its philosophy of war to this new, sightless dimension, or face annihilation. From the shadows, the race was on, but the starting pistol had been fired years before. In laboratories and research institutes half a world away, where the nature of seeing was being redefined not by biology, but by physics. This sets the stage for the strategic shock of night bombing and Japan's culturally ingrained reliance on visual combat. The narrative naturally leads into the technological foundations of the conflict. While pilots strained their eyes against the dark, the scientific war had been raging in silence for over a decade. The weapon that would decide the night war was not a gun or a bomb, but a pulse of electromagnetic energy. Its story began not on a battlefield, but in the theoretical realms of radio physics. In the 1930s, multiple nations stumbled upon the same principle: a transmitted radio. Waves hitting a metal object like an aircraft could return an echo. By measuring the time delay of that echo, one could calculate the object's range and direction. The British, with the existential threat of the Luftwaffe looming across the channel, poured resources and genius into the problem. By 1939, they had operational chain-home radar stations, wall of electronic sentinels that would prove decisive in the Battle of Britain. This was ground-controlled interception, GCI, the ability to see enemy formations at long range and vector defending fighters towards them, day or night. The United States, leveraging its unparalleled industrial and electronic capacity, rapidly refined the technology, developing smaller, more powerful sets for aircraft themselves. Airborne intercept AI radar. The Allied approach was systematic, integrated, and lavishly funded. It treated radar not as a curiosity, but as the central nervous system of a new kind of warfare, a B-17. Navigator using an H2S ground mapping radar saw the world not as terrain, but as a luminous sketch on a screen. A Mosquito night fighter pilot, guided by the calm voice of a ground controller watching a blip on a plan position indicator, PPI scope, could be steered into a killing position behind a German bomber he might not visually acquire until seconds before firing. For the Allies, radar was becoming an ecosystem. Japan's journey was strikingly different, yet it began from a similar point of scientific awareness. Japanese researchers, notably Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi and his student Shintaro Yuta, had made pioneering contributions to antenna design in the 1920s. The Yagi Yuta antenna is their legacy. The Imperial Japanese Navy, technologically progressive in areas like naval aviation and optics, initiated radar research as early as 1936 under the secretive name Denpa Tanshingi, or radio wave detection device. By 1941, they had produced the Type 2 Mark I Model 1 air search radar, installed at key land stations. The Army, typically more traditionalist, pursued its own parallel and competing program. But critical divergences doomed the Japanese effort from the start. First was fragmentation. Navy and Army development was not just separate, it was fiercely rivalrous. They used different frequencies, different components, different nomenclatures, creating a logistical nightmare and preventing the standardization crucial for mass production and operator training. Second was industrial limitation. Japan's electronics industry, while advanced in certain niches like vacuum tubes for radios, could not match the scale, quality control, or miniaturization prowess of American giants like Western Electric, Sperry, or MIT's Radiation Laboratory. Japanese radar sets were often larger, heavier, less reliable, and more power-hungry than their Allied counterparts. Most critically, there was a doctrinal blindness, the senior command steeped in the cult of the offensive and the supremacy of fighting spirit. Yamato Damasha viewed radar with skepticism. It was defensive, it was technological, it seemed to diminish the role of individual courage and skill. Resources and priority flowed to building more fighter aircraft and bombers, not to the unglamorous black boxes of electronic warfare. While a handful of visionary officers understood its potential, they fought a constant battle against institutional inertia. Thus, as the Allied night offensive gathered force, Japan found itself in a desperate technological scramble. It possessed the basic science, but lacked the unified will, industrial muscle, and tactical doctrine to forge it into a weapon that could truly reclaim the night. The stage was set for a clash not just of aircraft, but of fundamentally opposed philosophies of modern war. This completes the context, establishing the deep-rooted technological and doctrinal disparities that would define the coming struggle. The narrative now turns to the multifaceted human and technical dimensions of this conflict. To step into the cockpit of a Japanese night fighter in 1943 was to volunteer for a form of sensory deprivation torture punctuated by moments of sheer terror. These men were not mass-produced, they were a carefully selected, almost monastic order, drawn from the ranks of experienced pilots, often those with exceptional eyesight or night flying aptitude. They were the antithesis of the swaggering, ace of aces daytime fighter pilots. Theirs was a lonely, grinding war of attrition against the limits of human biology. Training was relentless and peculiar. Pilots spent hours in darkrooms, conditioning their eyes for night adaptation. They practiced identifying the faintest silhouettes against star fields, learning the distinct, dark profiles of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses. They flew endless navigation drills over featureless ocean, honing a dead-reckoning skill that bordered on intuition. In the air, the environment itself was an enemy. The constant straining scan of the blackness induced crippling headaches and vertigo. The drone of their own engines became a hypnotic dirge, while the sudden, gut-wrenching appearance of a bomber, materializing like a ghost ship only hundreds of feet away, sent adrenaline screaming through their systems. There was no room for error. A visual interception was a fleeting, intimate ballet in 3 dimensions, performed at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour. The margin between a kill and a mid-air collision was a matter of seconds and inches. Psychologically, they bore a unique burden. The homeland's defense against the nocturnal terror fell squarely on their shoulders. Every unseen bomber that passed overhead to unload its incendiaries on wooden paper cities was a personal failure. This pressure fostered a desperate, almost sacrificial zeal. Many forsook the careful textbook gunnery passes for near-suicidal ramming attacks, teatari, or developed radical close-range tactics to ensure a kill. They fought not just with aircraft, but with their own nervous systems, pushing human perception to its absolute breaking point. A battle where the enemy was increasingly aided by a machine that never blinked, never tired, and saw through cloud and darkness alike. They were the last practitioners of a dying art, the art of the human hunter in the electronic age. On the hardware front, the disparity between Japanese and Allied radar technology was a chasm that widened with each passing month. Japan's primary airborne intercept radar, the Type 3 Model 1 Navy, and Type 3 Army, known by the Allied code name MAT, was a telling symbol of the struggle. It operated on a relatively low frequency, requiring large, drag-inducing Yagi antenna arrays mounted on the aircraft's nose or wings. Its display was a simple oscilloscopic A-scope, a jagged green line on a cathode ray tube where a target appeared as a blip or pip, interpreting this required immense skill and guesswork. The blip indicated range but gave only ambiguous left-right steering cues, determining the target's altitude was nearly impossible. The sets were notoriously temperamental, susceptible to vibration, moisture, and tube failure. For the pilot, wrestling with the controls in turbulent darkness, trying to decipher the faint, flickering glow of the scope was a task that could overwhelm the most skilled operator. Contrast this with the Allied evolution, from the British AI Mark IV to the American SCR 520 and 540, the trajectory was toward higher frequencies, microwaves, smaller antennas often housed in streamlined radomes, and most importantly, more intuitive displays. The culmination was the American SCR 720, the magic box that equipped the purpose-built Northrop P-61 Black Widow. This was a centimetric radar with a parabolic dish antenna hidden in the aircraft's nose. Its display was a revolutionary plan. Position indicator, PPI, a circular screen where the own aircraft was at the center, and targets appeared as bright dots in their actual relative position, like a map of the sky. It could search, track, and guide the pilot all the way to a visual merge. It was, for its time, user-friendly automation. Japan could not close this gap. Every component, from the magnetron that generated the microwave signal to the precision waveguides and stable cathode ray tubes, was a product of an industrial and scientific base stretched to breaking point. While Japanese engineers understood the principles, they lacked the materials, the manufacturing precision, and the integrated electronic ecosystem to produce a reliable, compact AI radar in meaningful numbers. They were fighting with clever, improvised adaptations. While their opponents were deploying a mature, mass-produced system, it was a race, not just of invention, but of industrial metabolism, and Japan's was faltering. The first two angles have established the human cost and the core technological imbalance. The narrative now moves to how these factors manifested in the tactics and doctrines of both sides. The technological chasm gave birth to two fundamentally different doctrines of night combat. Japanese tactics remained an extension of the pilot's individual prowess, now adapted to the shroud of night. Units like the Navy's 302nd Air Group and the Army's Night Fighter Squadron developed methods that were ingenious, yet inherently limited. One common technique was the moonlight interception, gecko, where pilots would position themselves between the bomber stream and the moon, hoping to see the attackers silhouetted against its glow, a tactic wholly dependent on celestial cooperation. Another was the freelance hunt. Pilots, guided by rudimentary ground vectoring or sheer intuition, would patrol suspected ingress routes, their eyes serving as the primary sensor. The most effective Japanese tactic emerged from a technological shortfall: the upward-firing cannon, or shredge music, installed in aircraft like the Gecko and the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu. These fixed cannons, angled at 70 to 80 degrees, allowed a pilot to approach unseen from below, the blind spot of a bomber, and fire into its vulnerable belly without having to perform a complex, visible tracking maneuver from behind. It was a brutal, close-range solution that maximized the element of surprise and minimized the need for precise radar-guided gunnery. Yet, it still required the pilot to find the bomber first, a task growing more impossible by the month. Allied tactics, by stark contrast, were a symphony of centralized control and electronic coordination. The heart of the system was the Ground-Controlled Interception, GCI station. Here, operators watched large PPI scopes that painted a real-time map of the sky for dozens of miles. They could see the bomber stream, they could see their own night fighters, and they could calculate intercept vectors with cold precision. Via clear radio channels, a controller would talk his fighter pilot onto the target. Bandit 2 o'clock, 5 miles, descending slightly. Turn right to 090. I will call the merge. The pilot, his own AI radar perhaps silent to avoid detection, became an Extension of the ground system. In the Pacific, this evolved into the killer box tactic. Used by P-61 Black Widow squadrons, a designated sector of sky would be assigned to a Black Widow, guided and protected by its GCI controller, who ensured friendly aircraft didn't collide and that the fighter was methodically vectored onto the most promising targets. It was a slow, systematic, and devastatingly efficient process that turned the night sky into a partitioned hunting preserve. The individual brilliance of the pilot was not discarded, but it was now channeled and amplified by an invisible network of electrons and calm, professional voices. It was warfare as a science, leaving little to chance or unaided human instinct. The disparity in radar was merely a symptom of a deeper, fatal disconnect in the Japanese war machine, while the Allies developed radar as part of a fully integrated defense system. Japan treated it as a series of isolated technical gadgets. In Britain and America, radar was seamlessly woven into a vast network, early warning chains, GCI. Stations, anti-aircraft gun-laying radars, GL, identification friend or foe IFF systems, and airborne sets all communicated on standardized frequencies and shared data. Bombers' journey from detection to destruction was tracked and managed by a coordinated electronic organism. Japan never achieved this synthesis. Their early warning radar stations, often located on isolated islands, provided spotty coverage. GCI, when attempted, was primitive and rarely connected effectively to the fighter units. There was no effective IFF system, leading to tragic friendly fire incidents in the darkness. Most cripplingly, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy maintained separate, incompatible air defense networks over the homeland itself. An Army radar station might detect a B-29 formation, but could not directly communicate with a Navy Gecko sent to intercept it, and vice versa. This bureaucratic folly often left fighters groping blindly, even when the enemy was theoretically seen by the nation's own technology. This failure was rooted in the pre-war ethos of the Japanese military. The Navy and Army were not just separate services, they were rival empires competing for resources, prestige, and the emperor's favor. Joint planning was anathema. Centralized control was viewed with suspicion, as it threatened the autonomy of individual unit commanders. And the cherished initiative of the warrior, the concept of a unified technology dependent defense system run by technicians and controllers, was alien to a culture that venerated the sword and the spirit. Consequently, Japan produced pockets of technological innovation, the Gecko airframe, the Shredge music armament, even individual radar sets, but it could not produce a system. They fought a 20th century electronic war with a 19th century feudal command structure, and the night sky revealed this contradiction with devastating clarity. For the American bomber crews of the USAAF's 20th and 21st Bomber Commands, the early night missions over Japan were voyages into a realm of profound vulnerability. Flying at the extreme edge of their range in B-29 superfortresses, they were giant, silhouetted presences in the sky. The initial, sporadic Japanese night fighter attacks, though uncoordinated, were terrifying. A Gecko or Toryu, unseen until its cannon shells ripped through the fuselage from below, was the stuff of nightmares. The bomber's only initial technological shield was the AN/APQ-13 radar, a ground-mapping navigation set. While it could not find fighters, it was the key to the new American doctrine. Precision strategic bombing at night through overcast. It allowed them to find their city targets regardless of weather or darkness, a capability that made the entire campaign feasible, but it did not defend them. This dynamic began to shift radically in 1944-45. The B-29 itself became a hub of electronic warfare. It was equipped with a suite of defensive technologies that transformed the night from a blanket hiding predators into a filtered medium they could manipulate. Radar warning receivers, RWR, like the AN/APR-4, could detect the emissions from a Japanese fighter scanning matte radar. giving the bomber crew precious minutes of warning, a blaring alarm that the hunt was on. Active jammers, such as the AN-APT-1 carpet, emitted powerful radio noise to drown out and distort the Japanese GCI and AI radar signals, blinding both ground controllers and interceptors. Most importantly, the bombers began to receive their own protective umbrella. This came in the form of the dedicated, radar-equipped night fighter, the Northrop P-61. Black Widow for a B-29 crew, the knowledge that Black Widows, guided by offshore or island-based GCI stations, were patrolling their ingress and egress routes was a monumental psychological boost. The radio chatter changed. It was no longer just the tense internal intercom of the bomber. Now, it included the calm, professional exchanges between the GCI Marlin controllers and the P-61 Cutlass fighters. Hearing a controller say, "Cutlass 1, I have a bandit 6 miles at your 10 o'clock low." Vectoring you in was to hear the night itself being tamed. The hunter was now being hunted. The technological shield was no longer just passive armor, it was an active, extending spear. By the spring of 1945, the B-29 crews over Japan, though still facing flak in the persistent threat of attack, operated with the confidence of a force that owned the electromagnetic spectrum. The dark was no longer a neutral territory. American radar had made it their ally. 2 aircraft came to embody the philosophical and technological poles of the Pacific Night War. On the Japanese side, it was the Nakajima J-1N1S Gecko Irving. It was not designed as a night fighter. It began life as a failed long-range escort fighter, a 3-seat reconnaissance plane, but its airframe had virtues, stability, endurance, and the capacity to carry heavy armament. In a pattern typical of Japan's improvisational approach, it was adapted. The reconnaissance equipment was torn out. In its place, crews installed the MAT radar with its cumbersome antennas, and most lethally, 2 pairs of 20 Type 99 cannon fixed to fire obliquely upward and downward. The Gecko was a weapon of ambush. It was slow, not particularly maneuverable, but in the hands of a skilled pilot who could stalk visually or with his faint radar blip, it could deliver a devastating, surgical blow from the bomber's blind spot. It was the pinnacle of Japan's adaptive and individualistic night warfare, a converted airframe relying on a blend of crude technology and supreme crew coordination to execute a highly specialized close-range kill. Its natural-born opponent was the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. From its inception, it was designed for one purpose: to dominate the night. Every contour of its twin-boom muscular frame served that end. Its heart was the SCR-720 radar, housed in a sleek black radome at its nose, operated by a dedicated radar observer in the central crew nacelle. Its armament, 420 Hispano cannon in a ventral tray, and 4.50 caliber machine guns in a remotely operated top turret, was overwhelming. Designed to destroy a target with a single brief burst, it had the speed to catch a bomber, the range to loiter, and the electronic suite to find its prey with systematic certainty. Most symbolically, it was painted gloss black, a psychological weapon meant to blend into the night it commanded. The Black Widow was not an adaptation, it was a solution. It represented the Allied systemic and dedicated approach, purpose-built, technologically integrated, and mass-produced to establish absolute superiority in its chosen domain. The Gecko was the last, best hope of a military culture trying to retrofit a new kind of war onto old principles. The Black Widow was the embodiment of the new principles themselves. When they met in the skies over Japan, it was more than a duel of aircraft. It was a clash between an era ending and one being born. The theoretical nightmare of Japanese air defense planners became a screaming, four-engine reality in June 1944. The first B-29 Superfortress raid on the home islands. A strike against the Yawata Steelworks was a daylight operation, but it was a harbinger. The B-29 was a technological quantum leap, flying higher, faster, and with a greater bomb load than any aircraft Japan possessed. its pressurized cabins and central fire. Control systems represented a future Japan could not match, more critically, the failure of Japan's daytime defenses to stop these high-altitude raids pushed the USAAF's 21st Bomber Command under the relentless General Curtis LeMay toward a grim, logical conclusion. If daylight precision bombing was proving difficult due to jet streams and fierce winds over Japan, and if Japanese night fighters were still a sporadic, rather than systemic threat, then the most efficient path was a radical shift in tactics, LeMay's infamous order. In early 1945, stripped the B-29s of their defensive armament, except for the tail guns. An all but essential crew, the weight saved was converted into bomb load, specifically M69 incendiary clusters. The target shifted from industrial precision to urban area destruction, and the attacks would come at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and almost exclusively at night. This decision exposed the utter bankruptcy of Japan's visual night defense system. The low-altitude approach placed the bombers beneath the effective coverage of much of Japan's crude early warning radar network, which was optimized for high-altitude tracks. It rendered searchlight batteries almost useless as the bombers flitted through the ground clutter and below their optimal elevation, most catastrophically for the Japanese night fighter pilots. It negated their last celestial aid, the silhouette against the stars. The B-29s now flew against the dark, smoky tapestry of the Earth itself, visible only as fleeting, blurry shapes backlit by the very fires they were starting. The Japanese response reached new heights of desperation and diminished returns. The Gecko and Toryu units scored occasional kills, often using the shred music too. Brutal effect against bombers caught in searchlight cones or illuminated by the glow of burning cities below, but these were isolated triumphs in a cascading failure. Without effective GCI to vector them, pilots were reduced to patrolling assigned sectors, hoping to stumble upon the roaring, fire-spawning streams of B-29s. THE Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter Boku. Sentoki air defense fighters were like knights trying to stop a flood with swords. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots spoke of the despair of seeing entire cities. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka turned into roiling cauldrons of fire, knowing they had been powerless to prevent it, that their eyes and their courage were no longer the relevant currency in this exchange of annihilation. The stage was now set not for a battle, but for a demonstration of the total horrifying dominance that could be achieved when one side owned the night through technology and the other could only plead for a glimpse. This sets the stage for the single, catastrophic event that would serve as the definitive proof of this dominance. The narrative is poised to enter the heart of the firestorm. The night the sky turned to fire, March 9-10, 1945. The date was etched in meteorological logs and operational plans, March 9, 1945. The target was the heart of the Japanese Empire, the sprawling, densely populated eastern wards of Tokyo. Operation Meeting House was not merely another raid, it was a calculated experiment in urban thermodynamics and the ultimate test of a new form of warfare. That evening, 334 B-29 superfortresses of the 21st Bomber Command lifted off from airfields across the Marianas. They were ghost ships stripped for the mission. Their bomb bays were crammed not with high explosives, but with clusters of M69 incendiaries, napalm-filled tubes designed to create inextinguishable firestorms. Navigators hunched over their AN/APQ-13 radar scopes, the glowing images of the Japanese coastline and the distinctive shape of Tokyo Bay providing an unerring electronic path to their objective. Ahead of them, Pathfinder aircraft, using the more advanced AN/APQ-7 Eagle radar, marked the primary target zone with cascades of flaming markers. The entire armada flew under strict radio silence, a vast, dark serpent slithering across the ocean, guided by pulses of invisible energy. Over Tokyo, the night was clear and cold, with a brisk northerly wind. The conditions were perfect. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10, the first incendiaries began to fall. Within minutes, the mathematical precision of radar guidance met the chaotic physics of fire. Small individual blazes coalesced. The wind funneled through the tight maze of wooden houses and paper-thin walls became a bellows. Isolated fires leaped streets, merged, and began to generate their own weather system, a roaring, ascending column of superheated air that sucked oxygen from the outskirts inward at hurricane force. Firestorm, a phenomenon witnessed in Hamburg and Dresden, now engulfed the capital of Japan. The sky over Tokyo was no longer black. It was a monstrous, pulsing orange dome visible to aircrew over 100 miles away. Inside this inferno, the concept of Japanese night defense ceased to exist. The handful of geckos and army fighters that managed to scramble from fields like Naramasu or Chafu were not just blind, they were flying into a death trap. The thermal turbulence from the fires below was catastrophic, throwing aircraft about like toys in a maelstrom. The sheer convective heat threatened to melt canopies and stall engines. The blinding, omnipresent glow from the ground obliterated any chance of dark-adapted vision, while the smoke and rising debris created a physical wall. Radars, both ground-based and airborne, were swamped by clutter. The apocalyptic ground returned from the burning city rendered their scopes a meaningless bloom of light. For the American bomber crews, the scene was one of biblical horror and eerie detachment. Flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, they were low enough to feel the heat, to smell the burning through their ventilation systems, a scent of charred wood, flesh, and chemicals that would haunt them for life. The updrafts from the firestorm bounced the giant B-29s violently, yet electronically they were in a controlled environment. Their radars had delivered them. Their mission clock told them when to turn for home. The few disorganized attacks by Japanese fighters were swatted away by the remaining tail gunners or lost in the turbulence and glare. The P-61 Black Widows, operating on the peripheries, found no organized opposition to engage. The night had been transformed into a single, monstrous weapon, and the B-29s were merely its delivery mechanism. The few Japanese pilots who penetrated the chaos did so through raw courage, not system effectiveness. They were witnesses to an atrocity, not defenders of a city. By dawn, the flames had subsided into a vast, smoldering plain of ash, over 16 square miles of Tokyo were vaporized. The death toll, estimated at over 100,000, was greater than that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima 5 months later. But beyond the staggering human and physical destruction, Operation Meeting House delivered a strategic verdict of finality. It proved that American radar technology for navigation, for bomb aiming, for controlling the skies, had advanced to a point where it could orchestrate destruction on a scale that negated any form of traditional defense. Dark was no longer a neutral medium or even an ally in the hands of the United States Army Air Forces. It had become a cloak for annihilation. The technological war for the night was over. Japan had lost. In the cold calculus of war, the outcome of the night battle over Japan is recorded in a lopsided ledger of destruction. The strategic air campaign, culminating in the firebombing raids, achieved a level of devastation that rendered traditional military victory a formality. For the night fighter forces of Japan, the statistics tell a story of heroic but futile effort. From the introduction of the B-29 in mid-1944 to the end of the war, Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft defenses were credited with shooting down approximately 74 B-29s. A careful post-war analysis suggests the actual number destroyed by night fighters was likely far lower, with flak, operational accidents, and daytime fighters accounting for many of the losses, even using the most generous Japanese claims. This represents a loss rate of less than 1.5% of the total B-29 sorties flown, a rate that any strategic bombing commander of the era would have accepted. without hesitation. Contrast this with the price paid by the defenders, the elite cadre of Japanese night fighter pilots was systematically attrited, experienced crews, irreplaceable due to the collapsed training pipeline and fuel shortages, were lost to not just combat, but to the brutal conditions of night operations, controlled flight into terrain in poor visibility, engine failures, and the sheer exhaustion that led to fatal errors. Aircraft like the Gecko and Toryu, produced in painfully small numbers, only 479 J1NS and 1,691 Kai. 45s of all variants were ever built, were destroyed on the ground in Allied raids on their airfields or worn out from constant, desperate scrambling. By July 1945, the organized night fighter defense of Japan had ceased to function as a coherent system. What remained were scattered, ad hoc sorties by whatever aircraft were flyable, piloted by men who knew their mission was symbolic, not strategic. The true aftermath, however, was measured not in aircraft losses, but in national psyche. The failure of the night fighters to protect the homeland was the final, shattering blow to the myth of Japanese spiritual invincibility. For the civilian population, the message was unambiguous: the Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates and the Kokutai national polity, they were told to sacrifice everything, for could not protect them from the terror that fell from the night sky. The government's propaganda of certain victory crumbled under the rain of napalm. Evacuations of children from cities turned into a panicked, chaotic exodus. Worker absenteeism skyrocketed as populations fled urban centers. The social contract between the state and the people, already strained by years of privation, dissolved in the heat of the firestorms. The night, once a time of rest, became a time of dread, a waiting period for the sirens and the distant, dreadful hum of engines that technology could not silence. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had lost the electromagnetic war, and in doing so, they lost the belief of the nation they had sworn to defend. The silence that fell over Japan in August 1945 was not merely an absence of guns. It was the quiet of a laboratory as Allied technical intelligence teams descended upon the shattered empire in a race of their own. Operation Blacklist and the activities of the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, NAVTECJAP, had a specific target beyond weapons caches, the remnants of Japan's electronic warfare programs. What they found was a trove of fascinating, yet ultimately stunted, technology. Captured Gecko airframes with their matte radar sets were meticulously examined. Japanese scientists and engineers, including those from the Naval Air Technical Arsenal at Yokosuka and the Army's Research Institute, were interrogated. The Allied assessment was a mixture of professional respect and profound confirmation. They acknowledged the ingenuity of certain solutions. The Shred music installation was studied with keen interest, influencing post-war American night fighter designs. The basic principles of the Japanese radars were sound, but the overwhelming conclusion, documented in now declassified reports, was that Japan's efforts had been crippled by divided development, inferior production techniques, and a lack of appreciation of the operational importance of radar until it was too late. The hardware itself told the story. Vacuum tubes of inconsistent quality, hand-soldered components where the Americans used printed circuits, bulky magnetrons that were generations behind. This postmortem had immediate and profound consequences for the United States military. The Pacific Night War served as the first full-scale validation of a comprehensive electronic combat doctrine, the success of the integrated system from long-range early warning in GCI to airborne AI and electronic countermeasures, ECM, was not theoretical anymore. It had burned cities to the ground and broken an enemy's will to fight without a single ground troop landing on the mainland. This lesson became the bedrock of Cold War strategy. The newly independent U.S. Air Force invested massively in the semi-automatic ground environment SAGE system, a continent-spanning computer-driven network of radars and interceptors that was the direct, gigantic descendant of the GCI stations that had guided P-61s, the development of interceptors. Like the F-89 Scorpion, F-94 Starfire, and F-101B Voodoo centered on powerful, evolved versions of the SCR-720 radar and advanced air-to-air missiles. Furthermore, the night bomber's vulnerability to the upward-firing cannon spurred a revolution in bomber defensive design. The concept of the blind spot was electronically eliminated. The advent of the man-tail gunner gave way to remote radar-directed gun turrets and eventually to the philosophy of strategic deterrence. Through high-altitude, high-speed flight and ultimately standoff missiles, the era of the visual interception of the gun-armed fighter dueling with the bomber was declared over. The battle for the Pacific Night had proven that the next war would be won or lost. In the first seconds of electronic detection and counterdetection, it marked the definitive transition from the warrior in the cockpit to the system manager in the cockpit. A shift that continues to define aerial combat to this day. The dark had been conquered. Not by better eyes, but by better machines, and no military on Earth would ever forget it. The story of Japan's night fighters is not merely a tale of technological inferiority. It is a poignant elegy for a certain kind of martial virtue and a stark monument to the relentless impersonal logic of modern warfare. In the cockpit of a gecko, straining to see the unseen, we witness the last stand of the human sensor in aerial combat. Those pilots represented the culmination of millennia of martial tradition, courage, acute perception, and individual skill pushed to its absolute limit. They fought with a dedication that commands historical respect, but they were pitted against a new paradigm that rendered those ancient virtues tragically obsolete. The Allied victory in the electronic night was not a triumph of better men, but of a better system. It was the triumph of the collaborative, integrated machine, the radar engineer, the vacuum tube manufacturer, the GCI controller, and the pilot, all fused into a single weapon by a shared stream of data. This conflict marked the moment when air power ceased to be an extension of the pilot's body and will and became an extension of the laboratory and the factory floor. The dark was never truly the ally of the United States. Rather, American technology had achieved something more profound. It had dissolved the dark, rendering it irrelevant as a factor of concealment. In its place, they erected a new battle space, the electromagnetic spectrum, a domain invisible to the human eye but as tangible and controllable as any piece of terrain. The haunting lesson of the Pacific Night wore echoes in every generation of conflict that followed. It is a lesson about the cost of doctrinal rigidity, the fatal price of separating technology from tactics, and the unforgiving nature of industrial and scientific competition. The pilots who scanned the blackness for a glimpse of a bomber were not defeated because they lacked spirit. They were defeated because, in the end, spirit could not calculate a radar return, could not mass-produce a magnetron, and could not integrate a defense network. Their struggle stands as a timeless reminder. In the modern age, the battle is often won not where the flash and thunder erupt, but years earlier, in the quiet rooms where science, industry, and strategy choose their paths. The dark ceased to be a sanctuary the moment humanity learned to see without light.